The City of Ann Arbor Energy Commission is called to order. Could we do the roll call, please?
Sure. Commissioner Hookham.
Here.
Commissioner Paleg.
Here.
Commissioner Lenski.
Here.
Commissioner Mirsky.
Here.
Vice Chair Clevey.
Here.
Commissioner Levin.
Here.
Commissioner Schreibert.
Here.
Commissioner Colvin Garcia.
Here.
Councilmember Eaton.
Here.
Obviously, I am not Commissioner Wayne Appleyard. He is sick tonight, and we all feel for him. I'm glad he's not bringing it back to us. I'm Vice Chair and sitting in for this evening. Have an agenda for approval. I assume everyone has had a chance to look at the agenda. I will entertain a motion to approve the agenda.
So moved.
Second.
Motion, the agenda is approved. We now have the approval of the minutes. I know that we've all read this a lot, especially John. John reads these. He has red lines and things like that. Any additions or changes to the minutes? Seeing none, I'll accept a motion to approve the minutes.
So moved. That's the
Second.
November
Second.
minutes, right? Yep.
All in favor?
Aye.
The minutes have been approved. We have two opportunities in our agenda for public input, and this is one. Notice we have some people in the audience. Would you like to say a few comments to us, or introduce yourself, or just wave and say hi? Anyone? All right.
You have a chance again later.
You'll have a chance later, right? Again. All right. So we have no public input at this time. We can now move on to energy fraud news from staff and commissioners. First item of business is the 2018 appointments, chair, vice chair, and environmental commission's representative. I've talked with Wayne Appleyard. He is willing to serve. Again, I'm willing to serve as vice chair, and John Mirsky is willing to serve as environmental commission's rep. So I'll make the first motion to appoint Wayne, or elect Wayne Appleyard as our chair for another term.
So moved.
Anyone like to make any other nominations?
I would just say Wayne was certainly willing to take it on. We
Willing
didn't
to.
want to
Yes, that's true. Willing to.
disallow anyone else the opportunity, so.
Any nominations for vice chair?
Any other eager beavers?
Anybody else want this coveted position? Anybody willing to nominate me?
Oh, I,
Nominate you.
Oh, thank you.
second.
Okay. Any other individuals would like to throw their hat in the ring here for chair or vice chair? Having heard none, I think the nominations are closed. We can vote. Correct?
Yeah, and
Or-
likewise for the environmental rep. John, I
think that's an
wasn't able to
appointed-
confirm, but I
that's-
think you're up for that.
I think
Yeah,
that's an appointed, it's
Yep,
not
yep.
elected.
Makes sense.
It's appointed, not elected.
Is it?
Oh,
Oh,
I think it's, yeah,
right.
either way, just confirming.
Hold on, we'll get them soon. So, we need a vote?
All in favor, yeah.
All in favor for Wayne Appleyard as chair and myself as vice chair for the coming year?
Aye.
Aye.
Any nays? So we have a new chair and vice chair. In my newly elected position, I would like to reappoint John Mirsky as our Environmental Commission representative for the next year.
Thank you.
Thank you. You have accepted. We can now move on to the next presentation, I understand, which is the Michigan Large-Scale Solar Project Issues Overview by Commissioner Hookham.
Before I do that, I would suggest maybe Mark and sorry for the interruption, but we had one line item which was kind of a energy report news
Yes.
from staff. We
Yep.
kind of
Yep.
skipped that. I don't know if it was worth coming back to that, but are we going to do that?
And just our usual energy.
Oh, energy,
news
I'm
update.
sorry. That's
The
right.
roundtable.
It doesn't show up on my,
It's just on
the one that was handed out. It doesn't have that one.
Yeah, it's just, yeah, it's underlined in a.
Oh, okay,
weird sort
all
of
right,
way,
yes,
yeah.
right,
So,
sorry.
yeah, real quick, I'll just hop in. Briefly, the forums for 2018 have started, our annual sustainability forum. So the first is this Thursday. So always appreciate commissioners coming out if you can. That again is the 11th at the downtown branch, and the topic for the January event is electric vehicles. So the event will be emceed, so to speak, by Charles Griffith, the Director of the Climate and Energy Program at the Ecology Center. Bruce Westlake from the Michigan Electric Auto Association will be on hand, as will Andrew Renz, Principal Marketing Specialist for DTE, to share their latest emerging focus on supporting EV adoption in the area. Alex Karos is the Manager for Vehicle and Advanced Technology for GM and involved with Maven, so the sort of car share side of EVs. And then Terry Richards is Head of Sustainability Projects for Mahindra here in town. He's talking about the motor scooter option there as well. So, and note beforehand, we have a electric vehicle showcase event going on right outside in Library Lane beforehand. So if you've yet to sit in, check out a Bolt, probably a Tesla or two will be on hand. We've got some spots secured. That'll be just north of the entrance to the library from 5 to 7, and then with the event beginning at 7 o'clock to 8:30, 9 o'clock. And then February 8th is Measuring and Tracking Sustainability as a topic. Commissioner Mirsky will be one among others on hand for that, talking about our own progress towards sustainability efforts. March 8th is civic life in Ann Arbor will be the topic on the 8th, and then April 12th, water, Water 101, 201, and 301. So look forward to those. Let's see, the 16th of January, just another event I caught coming up, is the Sierra Club Huron Valley Group is presenting Solar Truths, Myths, and Promises on Tuesday, January 16th at 7:30 at the Mathai Botanical Gardens, 1800 North Dixboro. And Craig Topfer, who was recently here at the commission, is the primary presenter for that. So did want to share that as well. And lastly, a couple things. The Green Fleets policy, which we recently reviewed, should be up at council's next available session to approve that. Thank you to folks who got additional input and comment. We really tried to incorporate that input received late last year to update that fleets issue. So that's coming soon, and just noting that we're reconvening work on the Bryant Community Center solar project. So as that project is kind of coming together, recall that we did a program with DT where they granted some dollars towards a variety of initiatives that folks could vote on in exchange for utilizing DTE services through sort of an online portal. And some funds were put aside to help get solar on the Bryant Community Center. So we'll be working on that in the summer months here. So that's it for me.
Have anything new on the solar schools project? Anything worth reporting?
Nothing tangible to report, however, for our February meeting, we will have an update.
Excellent, outstanding. Any other reports? Anything we missed?
Maybe I can do it now. Should I do it now, giving an update of the last Environmental Commission meeting? Would that be appropriate?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. As you know, I am the liaison on the Environmental Commission. The last Environmental Commission meeting was dedicated to solid waste issues. We had city staff come in and present. Great showing from staff. Creston Slaughton made the presentation, but Craig Hupy, Christina Gomez, and Molly, I forget her last name.
Majewski, I believe. Majewski. It's
Majewski.
a long one with many syllables.
Okay.
We all struggle with it.
They were all present, and some of them then entertained questions from staff. They basically covered, and I encourage people actually to look at the presentation, which is obviously posted online under Legislar. But they gave us an update on the MRF. So the MRF has been inoperable as a MRF since June of 2016. That was really going back to issues with re-community. There was also a fire at the MRF in August. So right now the MRF is, I think most people know, or if you've been in touch with these kinds of issues, it's not been operating as a MRF, and recycled materials are being shipped to Ohio for processing. So that's obviously not a very good situation. Obviously additional greenhouse gases and additional costs associated with that. Right now it looks like there's nothing in the short term that's going to get us out of that situation. There also were some issues with Baylor and conveyor that has prevented cardboard, or what's referred to as OCC, from being processed in an efficient way. The city is processing now a purchase order to be able to repair that so that that can be shipped and recycled efficiently locally and saving some money that way. There was also a report on the solid waste fund and the development of the reserve on that. That peaked in, I think it was fiscal year 15 at $15 million. For a couple of years, it had been between $12 and $14 million. And we were shown at the commission meeting that that was going to take a real nosedive and actually was forecasted to go below zero in fiscal year 21. Just as a note to that, I attended a meeting this afternoon, and it turns out that those figures are not correct, and the reserve should stay healthy. The administrator, working with staff, will send an update to correct that figure. A couple of other things that were updated, as I said, the whole meeting was really dedicated to that, was an update on the composition of our recycled materials and the level of residuals that cannot be processed. So residuals are right at under 11%. That's pretty consistent with what we've had in the past. So that's actually a good thing. It's not that we've seen a big increase in residuals that then have to go to landfill.
John, is that because we're collecting things we can't recycle, or is it because people are putting the wrong things in the recycling bin?
It's a combination of things. It's things that don't belong in the recycling bin. And then also, to some degree, it's based on the fact that, for example, glass shards, you put a piece of glass in, it breaks, it turns into shards that can't be recovered easily, and so there's a residual for that. And then also some recycling materials cross-contaminates through all the processing and the shipping and everything like that. So basically, we're getting 90% of what essentially goes into recycling is actually recycled, and we get revenue streams for some of that, obviously, for things like cardboard, aluminum, things like that. There's other things that we don't get much money for just because the commodity markets have collapsed. Another thing that came up more in questioning was the status of our diversion rates. The diversion rate, as a city, has been reporting it, and we got some additional meeting information after the meeting, is sitting at roughly 45–46%. It's been at that level since 2013. So actually, the level is in itself not bad. It's higher than the goal that was set back actually for the solid waste plan from 2013 through 2017, but it's basically been flat. In, again, some correspondence and discussion with the city after the meeting, we need to look at that figure to see how accurate it is. For example, the residuals that I talked about, the 10% of recycled materials, is apparently not included in that, so that would indicate that it potentially is actually a little bit lower, the total diversion rate. On the other hand, there are some other diversions that are not included in the calculation, so the intent is for the city to look at that and try to report more accurate numbers, maybe possibly even two figures. One is a figure that sort of reflects everything that the city diverts, but also maybe a second figure that's more in line with what figures that other cities quote when they quote what their diversion rate is. So more to be determined on that level. And then the last thing that we talked about and was reported on in discussion was staffing resources. There was a report, or actually I should say a graph, that showed the development in the number of resources working on solid waste and recycling going back in 2010. It showed a decrease from 2.5 to 1.5 headcount with the plan to increase that again. What it didn't show was the fact that prior to 2010, there was actually a dedicated department focused on composting, recycling, solid waste. And at one time in the 2000s, there had been a peak of roughly 5 people working in that area. with a total number of experience of roughly 125 years, and that's really taken a nosedive in the meantime. So there was a lot of comments afterwards from commission encouraging the city to see if some of these issues that they had reported potentially correlated with some of the headcount and experience issues. There was some pushback back and forth. I know that the city is seriously looking at that and engaging consultants as they have on a number of different things. But that was roughly a 2-hour meeting, all dedicated to solid waste. And if you're interested in more information, as I said, look at the presentation. And if you really want to get into details, watch the video of the meeting.
Question, John, in all that processing, has anyone looked at opportunities for energy generation as a result of the processing that goes on there? Are they generating any heat? It seems like they would be generating something.
So my understanding is that they do not. There's been some studies looked at a biodigester from the perspective of the wastewater treatment plant. There are some cities that incinerate waste and generate energy that way, but generally that is going out of favor for lots of reasons, not least of which are what goes up the smokestack is in many cases not very good, and that obviously then goes into the environment and the local neighborhoods. So my understanding, and Nate, correct me if I'm wrong, for what you know, also just from the energy side, the city does not generate any energy from waste other than what you could say is maybe the landfill where we capture methane and use that.
Right, yeah, we have the closed landfill system,
Right.
landfill energy
Yeah.
system, about 800 kW.
I thought I read somewhere that a portion of Ann Arbor's waste goes to the Detroit incinerator. Perhaps that was incorrect.
I don't think that's true.
Okay.
To my knowledge, not, but I won't say that absolutely definitively.
Yeah. The other thing I would flag too, and I'm sure folks have taken this into consideration, but I know on a statewide level, the DQ and others are looking at legislative changes to Michigan's regulations around landfilling and recycling and all that, based largely off of the work group recommendations that came out last year. And I'm sure they're taking that into consideration, but if not, that would be something to definitely look at too.
So maybe I have 2 other things I should comment on that were not discussed in great detail, but I think are generally relevant and of interest to the group. First of all, the city is working with the county. So also in that meeting, the county made a brief presentation of its solid waste plan, and the county is working with entities within the county to look at a regional approach to waste. So instead of individual cities operating individual MRFs and having their own waste disposal and landfills and everything like that, there's an opportunity for entities like municipalities, townships, universities, EMU Michigan, et cetera, to be able to come together. The Ann Arbor is very interested in that. Other entities are as well. So there are some, basically what the city is doing now is it has to update its solid waste resource management plan, and that would basically be for the interim. So how do we look at what we're doing today, where are inefficiencies, and how do we improve on that, and transition potentially to, not necessarily, but potentially to a regional plan, and how do we align contracts and things like that, so that is facilitated. Mike, yeah.
I was going to ask about the food waste composting, or the composting program, and extending it to year-round, because I know there's been discussion of that. And I would just say I'm increasingly interested, because from my perspective as a observer, close observer of what's been going on, the city's been going backwards on recycling now for a bit through some mismanagement of contracts and some other pieces. And I just think it's something that, as Energy Commission, we should be aware of. That's not a huge impact on greenhouse gas emissions, but it is an impact. But one of the places where there's been some positive progress, I think, is on the composting program and actually extending it to food waste. But then a lot of talk about extending it to year-round. Did that come up? Because right now it's not. I believe sometime in December it ends, and then it picks up again in, is it April? Or March?
Yeah,
Maybe
it's
March?
basically, it corresponds right now with yard waste.
Right.
And I guess more as an aside, so right now, you can put compostable organics in with your compost bin. I think there's probably not a high level of awareness of that, and there's actually a group of, actually two groups that are working together to develop what's sort of been termed a green grant. There's now in the fiscal year 18 and 19 budget money, $100,000 for what you might also call neighborhood partnership programs, where people come forward and say in a neighborhood or in a ward, we would like to do this, and whether it's sustainability related or whatever, they would basically vie for funds from the city to match in kind what they're doing in terms of volunteer time and things like that. And Mike, to your question about composting, there is a proposal that's in preparation that I've been assisting with that would try to increase awareness about composting, also actually monitor the results. Some of you have looked probably at your carts and noticed that on the recycling cart, there's a sticker that says this is what you can and can't recycle. There's nothing like that on the compost bins that tells people, hey, you can do organics, but you shouldn't put logs in there that are 20 inches in diameter. You can only put them up for 4 inches, things like that. So the idea is that stickers would go on compost bins, and then obviously what we would like to be able to do with that is demonstrate that composting and organics, let's say management, can increase and make an argument then that we would be able to go to year-round composting. Right now, it's more a resource issue than anything else in terms of running all the crews to be able to do that on a year-round basis, especially when there's not a lot of yard waste, obviously, during the off months. So if we can get the other kinds of organics in there, then there's maybe more of an argument to do year-round compostables.
Sure, or even training folks. I mean, I know myself and many others just put the food waste in the bin for, it lasts for us through the winter. So the first pickup's all food waste, and then you go back to yard waste, and it works just fine.
Yep. And by the way, this is related to Energy Commission work because there are methane emissions. We capture some, but generally, obviously, that's not entirely the case. So anything that we can do to increase our diversion rates is going to benefit greenhouse gas emissions, and that's a climate action goal. Thanks for the opportunity.
Outstanding. Any other? Oh, please.
Mr. Klese and Mr. Appleyard and I had the pleasure of sitting down with the city administrator last Friday morning to discuss the GeoStellar debacle. And although staff seems to be intent on not discussing the past in any detail or allowing anybody to characterize our relationship with GeoStellar as partners, I came away from the meeting feeling confident that we've learned an important lesson, and that this city administrator, who wasn't present when we entered into those relationships, is going to be much more careful going forward on such relationships. In case you don't know, we kind of sought out the Clean Energy Coalition to partner with GeoStellar and market home installations of solar panels, and GeoStellar has all but gone bankrupt, leaving a lot of homeowners kind of in the lurch. A local provider stepped in and said that they would install the solar panels without regard to the amount of money that has already been given to GeoStellar as a down payment or a deposit. So our constituents haven't suffered, but certainly our local provider is going to take the blow for that. And hopefully we've learned a lesson here about partnering with other entities that going forward we won't make the same mistakes.
Just a brief correction from my understanding, and Nate, you can comment. There's actually two installers. Both were installers under the agreement between CEC and GeoStellar to do installations locally, and both of those installers have stepped up and said that they, working with the local distributor, McNaughton McKay, will make sure that all of the customers of the so-called A2 Solar Club will be made whole. So between McNaughton McKay, Oak, and Michigan Solar Solutions, Nate, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's the declared intent.
Is that program over with, or is there a plan, if it's continuing, are they searching for better partners essentially, or is it done for?
Well, the program as it was is certainly concluded or concluding as these projects wraps up. There's definitely an interest for a next iteration, a different iteration of some form, as has been discussed at this body and elsewhere to figure out where to go next with solar programming. But
My understanding is that there is, an intent on just about everybody who's interested in this, finding some way to go forward with this, and to do lessons, as Commissioner Eaton has stated, lessons learned, and figure out how to move forward. The business community, I've had the privilege of being on the Great Lakes Renewable Energy Association's Board of Directors, and all of the businesses that are affected in this program are members, and two of them have, one of them is currently a board member, and another one has been a board member. So I hear things, and I know the business community was happy for the most part that the city was trying to find ways to stimulate the market here, and that the city over the last year did a number of things, including streamlining the permitting processing and removing the permitting fees on solar. So all these things feed into lowering the cost and things, and there's an interest on the business community to find a program that works for everybody and that gets around some of the problems that we had with working with an out-of-state contractor. Anyone else? Well, Commissioner Hookham, I guess you're on.
So those of you who know me know I talk very quickly. This is meant to be interactive. I'm going to speak from this position because I can see everybody from one spot without getting to be twisting my neck too much. So I'm going to talk quickly. Wave your hand, interrupt me. This is meant to be interactive. I do apologize. Some of the slides are pretty simplistic. For those of you solar vets, I don't want to get you upset with me, but we're going to start kind of from scratch and go work our way up. My name is Chuck Hookham. I've got about 35 years experience all over the state and all over the world in conventional, nuclear, and renewable power. I've got about 25 years in renewables, which is kind of scary looking. And 25 years seems like an incredibly long time, and I'm getting too old for these kinds of things. And then I've also been involved more recently on transmission and distribution and trying to solve some of those dilemmas because those remain to be a challenge for us. First slide is a large solar project. So this is DTE's project in Lapeer. I encourage you to go see it. I put in a bad picture for a reason. You can see the expressway in front of it. It's I-69, so you can see from a scale point of view how big this is. This is 250 acres of solar panels. So when we talk about large scale, I wanted to make sure people are not thinking rooftop. This is not a rooftop presentation. This is on large scale. So we're talking 1 megawatt, 5 megawatts and up. This is the largest solar project in Michigan. DT went commercial with this last year. It's about 48 megawatts. I'm the project director for a large one that's going to be the second largest in Michigan. It'll be the largest in terms of in terms of single axis tracking. And I'll get into that discussion here. That was the purpose of this talk, is to talk a little bit about what we can do to be better about solar and all the lessons we're learning. So with that, I'll move forward. But it's a great project to go see if you have a chance. It is a fixed system, so the panels do not move at this one. So why large-scale solar? We're going to get into a few slides in a minute, but just in summary, there are areas in this country which have a lot of radiation. So this is the sunlight shining on our ground for an extended period of time. Michigan, unfortunately, is the third cloudiest state, so you haven't seen a proliferation of solar in Michigan for that reason. It's not a great state for solar. It is a great state for wind, and so we've seen a lot of wind build out, and it continues to be that way. Just from a perspective of capacity factor, we always talk about how much can I generate over a course of a year. Solar is about 14 to 17%. Wind is about 35 to 45. So we're getting a lot bigger percentage of time when we can generate with wind than we can with solar. Hence, the typical traditional move is let's build more wind. But solar is starting to gain some perspective, and I'll explain why. One of them is we're seeing the costs come down, and I'm going to show you a slide in a minute that's pretty eye-opening as you can see what's happening in the cost of solar going in, which is great, and that's promoting a lot of growth. Economies of scale, so we're talking large scale, and this is a reason why large scale makes more and more sense, and why this could be extrapolated to a community solar project in Ann Arbor, why those kinds of things make sense, and I'll show that very clearly soon. Renewable portfolio standards, I'll show a graph on that in a second. It talks about states, Michigan's now at 15% by 2021. Obviously, we have more to build. We made the 10% by 2015, we being the industry. Now we're at another hurdle. So we're moving toward that next hurdle, and we're making good strides that way. Sustainability and diversity goals. I've got a customer of mine, it's called Switch. They just opened a facility in Grand Rapids. They effectively negotiated with one of our companies, CMS Consumers Energy, for 110 megawatts of firm capacity renewables in Michigan. So that's doable now with large scale. That's a huge commitment from Switch to do that, and they're being met. That's being serviced in Michigan with renewables. This is not RECs, this is renewables. So it's a great story to tell, and we're going to see more and more big companies doing this, I think, from a sustainability point of view. Carbon reduction, if you go to the East Coast, there are big mandates in each of the states on the East Coast to do carbon management. California has a huge reduction goal. So those are the states where you see renewables in force. And in California's case, obviously, you'll see why in a minute with respect to sunlight. And then there are lots of options. So we're seeing tailored solutions, photovoltaic, thermal solar, concentrating solar. I'll talk about those in a minute. You can see that if you want to go have a beer afterwards, I'm going to head to Arbor Brewing. I had the pleasure of working on Arbor Brewing's roof, and that's got probably, I'm not aware of any others in Michigan, solar PV and solar thermal side by side. Solar thermal heating the water in their facility, solar PV obviously reducing their electric demand. So great facility, great, and that's been in service now at least 5 years. So it's been a great fit. And I'll talk a bit more about that here in a sec. So these are the large scale alternatives we typically look at. So the upper left is solar PV with a wind turbine. We're actually marrying some of these now, where we're marrying solar with wind. They actually generate at different times. Solar PV tends to peak in the afternoons. Wind tends to peak at different times, not necessarily in the middle of the afternoon, but actually building up in the morning and in the afternoon as well, later after the solar peak. So we're seeing that being sustainable, and then we're putting batteries in now. So we're actually grabbing all three, and we're using the battery at night when we can use that effectively. I'm not going to talk about the duck curve in California. We don't have a duck curve here. California's got its own share of problems with renewables and integrating with the grid. Michigan's not so bad, but we still have some ramping up and ramping down issues we're contending with. Hence, and I'm going to be a proponent of this, stepping into our RPS in Michigan, going in stepwise format makes a lot of sense. Trying to do 100% by 2025 or something that's not easily done, it's simply difficult to do, and I can talk and debate on that later, but that's my perspective. Doing this in steps makes sense. The lower left is concentrating solar. Not a great picture, but in concentrating, what we're doing is grabbing sun, reflecting it, positioning it at something that's collecting this solar, whether it's a tower or whether it's parabolic focused on a specific tank or pipeline or something like that, heating up molten salt, storing that molten salt, generating the molten salt power at night with a steam turbine. So we're actually collecting it during the day when the sun's out and generating at night with the molten salt. So it's been an interesting proposition. There's probably over 900 megawatts now in the United States of solar thermal, mostly out west. Lower right is a dual axis PV system. You can actually see this. This is a great picture. You can see the sun coming out, and you can see all the panels positioned in different directions. And I'll get into more of that in just a minute. Upper right is more of a general facility. I talked about Arbor Brewing. This is where solar thermal is simply being used to heat your hot water. So that's being done at a large scale now. And it's why I live in large scale solar. There's a few large operations that are just simply heating water with it. again, particularly out west. Okay, so simple interconnection. So if you were to do solar at your house, it would look not much different than this. This is the guts and the mindset of how we operate these facilities. One thing to note on this is our inverters, and I've done a lot of work with inverters. Our new inverters are pretty cool in the sense that I can actually, from my desk now, and I'll show it in more detail, change settings on the inverter on the fly. I can trip the unit. I can trip sections of my solar system on the fly. So if a utility sends me a signal saying, hey, we have a problem, or hey, we have a power factor correction issue, or hey, our frequency's out of whack, I can do things from my desk. And it's actually pretty cool nowadays what we can do through the SCADA system. So again, I'll get into that in just a minute as far as what we can do and what we can't do anymore. But again, large-scale systems, we're seeing this become more and more prevalent. Another cool technology is we're actually taking data from sites wirelessly to a cloud, and I could have this whole room looking at my solar system, and I'll show you a dashboard in a minute, what we can do and what we can't do in terms of our knowledge base and how we can actually learn from things we're doing. This is a great picture, and I apologize for this, but it's as big as I can produce it, but I think most people can see it. Hopefully the audience can see this, but it's basically comparing. This is levelized cost of generation. Mr. Kerber, you and I have talked a little bit about this, I know, and how things are shaping up. So over here on the upper right corner, we're seeing solar PV, rooftop residential. Just think about this as cost, higher cost to the right, lower cost to the left. You're seeing the residential piece, now you're seeing, stepping downward in solar, how the costs are coming down. We get down to the middle graph, we're talking solar PV at a utility scale, which is our large scale again. You can see how much cheaper it is for us to build utility scale solar, 43 to 45 bucks a megawatt hour versus this residential. So I could put in our 5,000 solar roofs program back in play. Makes no sense economically to have all these people own these software or this type of rooftop solar. Really doesn't make sense just in terms of pure cost. Another cool thing that this graph shows is if we start layering storage, what that looks like. So these gold figures look at the cost of storage, all in levelized dollars per megawatt hour. You can see where solar plus storage is actually cheaper now than any of the other solar systems out there in terms of its installation cost and its levelized cost. So it's really been a big transition and trend in recent year to see that happening. And so I'm working in this area quite a bit now. You can see solar thermal tower, that's this middle curve. You can see the cost of that. That is a wider band in reality because it's so difficult and it depends site-wise where you're at. And then we step down through some of the other technologies. You can see they're reasonably coming down in cost, microturbines, things like that, geothermal, but they're still not where we can get to a solar PV from a utility scale. So I think that's really exciting from a community solar perspective again. Below the dotted line, we have our conventional sources. Just a few things to pop up. The very bottom graph is gas combined cycle. The problem with solar, again, has always been we can't store it. It's got to be dispatched. At the time we generate it, it's got to be absorbed in the system in terms of demand. As we store it, we can store it now and use it later after we've generated the electricity. The cool thing about that is you're starting to see cost of solar plus storage starting to equal gas combined cycle. The old argument of intermittency is going away slowly. As we were able to generate and store, the concept of generating with gas is starting to become a little bit suspect. So again, scale factor being a little bit more important to talk about, we're starting to see these costs really starting to push renewables forward, and I think that's a good thing.
Chuck, before you leave that slide,
Yep.
2 questions,
Yeah.
if I may.
Sorry. I don't know how to go back. There we go.
Maybe left click or something. There we go. Good. My understanding is that looking internationally and some of the PPA agreements that have been signed, there are PPA agreements for huge solar PV installations that are going in at almost half of the 43 that you show here.
Right.
Now, those I don't believe are in the U.S., and they're obviously signed, they're not realized, but there's an indication that these costs will come down even further. Is that correct?
It's correct, and I'll have a slide coming up that's you'll see it crystal clear. Just hang on a second.
So one other question that hopefully other have a slide for, or at least can comment on, and that is, obviously, these don't show externalities
Right.
So there's no indication of what the cost is to human health because of mercury that's
Right.
associated with coal, burning coal, or whatever else the case may be. That's correct as well, right?
That's correct. This
Yep.
is
Oh,
levelized.
and there's not really universal agreement on what those externality costs are, probably.
Right, this comes out of a research organization called Lazard. They're pretty much like any other research institute, not biased in any way. I'll give that to them. I actually supported both their levelized cost of storage and their levelized cost of energy, so I was involved in this. Innovation was involved in this, and other think tanks, so there's been a lot of thought put into this. And other than some of those soft costs that are more humanistic, I think these are trying to get to apples and apples the best we can.
Yep.
So these do have things like property cost and others built in. So they're as close as we can get to without getting, again, into the weeds too far where we can't quantify those numbers so easily. Yes, sir.
I'm not
This says
sure we're,
cost of generation.
It's all right.
There's also delivery, distribution, transmission.
Right.
Which is a totally different thing. So the business makes a decision based on things like this.
Right.
They're looking, how does my cost compare? If you can compare it to your generation cost, but they're also paying 1/3 of the additional for just getting electricity from a power plant that's 60, 80 miles away.
Right. So that's why some of this has to be site-based. Some of this could make more sense in different places. So I'm working in Nevada on this, as a matter of fact, where we've got to wheel power hundreds of miles. Well, that gets expensive. If I have to compare that cost to putting in something smaller, maybe by Las Vegas, where I don't have to wheel it so far, it makes a big difference. But this is trying to get to the substations. This is bus bar costs. This is not wheeling it from Reno to Las Vegas or something like that. But it's as levelized as we can get. And I'd be happy if you can go online. This is actually a free report. You can actually get into the footnotes on this. It's a good report to look at. So they have a levelized cost of energy and one of storage. I'd encourage you all to look at it. But again, the devils are in the detail.
Thanks.
So this is the RPS. Uniquely, the Southeast doesn't have many states that are pushing for renewables. The East Coast obviously has quite a bit. The West Coast has quite a bit. The Midwest is starting to see bigger and bigger pushes, particularly Minnesota and Illinois have some pretty big RPS goals. I'd like to say we're hitting them. I'm not sure some of these other states are as successful, but we'll see. I mean, it's part of the equation of setting stretch goals, as we call them, to see where we can go to. Hawaii's got 100% by 2045. I worked out there for a bit. They got their hands full. There are ways they can make that happen, but we'll see how it goes. But Michigan, 15 by 2021's there. Like I said, our 10% by 2015 was met without too many problems. I don't believe 15% by 2021 will be a challenge. One thing that's popped up is we have had some pushback on wind in Michigan, so having projects like Lansing, Delta Solar, we have to have a little bit of diversity here. We can't all depend on wind. So NIMBY's becoming a little bit of a problem for wind, and we're having to look at other places. I did work offshore a bit in the Great Lakes, trying to get some offshore wind started. The costs are pretty high. We've got some other things like Jones Act that cause trouble, but solar is easier to permit, and in the NIMBY part of it's not so hard. So you'll see probably more and more solar as a result of RPS goals going forward. Here's the map I wanted to show you on irradiance. Again, you've got a couple things going on. So this upper left graph is residential rates. So you can see the Northeast, you got Maine and New York, and up there the costs are very high. You got California is very high, Alaska and Hawaii are very high. And then you've got us in the mid-range, you got some states that are really low. So you want to factor in the thought process here when we talk about renewables in terms of what are the current rate drivers. Industrial's over on the upper right, not too much different. You see the Northeast, California are really high, out west is really high. So you're starting to see reasons why maybe C&I customers or commercial industrials want to invest in their own power. You can build things pretty inexpensively nowadays and source yourself. You're seeing larger plays of renewables in these areas for sure because of rates being high. And then you look at the irradiance. This is an NREL curve. You can get this online. You can see obviously California, Arizona, New Mexico out west, tremendous solar resources. That's where you're seeing tremendous growth in solar, particularly utility scale where it makes a lot of sense, where this land is less valuable, let's say, less populated. The challenge there, to a point raised earlier, is we have to transmit it further to population centers. But you know, at one time we talked about just lining all of Nevada that's not populated with solar cells and just wheeling the power. You could probably get away with doing some of that in a larger scale, and some of that actually is starting to pop up a little bit more. I'll just leave it at that. Michigan, not so great solar radiation. We're probably middle to low in terms of that. I mentioned that earlier. And that's been a somewhat of a barrier, as we simply don't generate as much electricity as in other places. And I'll talk about that in just a minute. You also note our rates aren't huge drivers. The rates from utilities that we pay are not like they are in other places, so that may be another driver for that. Real quickly, I'll get into some differences. So just envision this for the moment. Fixed tilt is what you see on people's roofs. It's built with an anchored system. It doesn't move. It stays positioned. It usually points to the south at some directional angle. Typically in Michigan, we like to see 34 to 40 degree range. I've got friends with 45. They don't get the peaks, but they have 45-degree angle panels. I've put in some systems that are adjustable tilt where you can manually go out and adjust them to affect the sun. And that way, what we're trying to do there is down in the bottom right corner, if you've noticed up in the sky, in June, the sun's above us. In the wintertime, it's off to the south. So you can position your panels to a certain extent to capture that change in height of the sun. Very important in the wintertime. Then we have trackers. So we'll talk single axis, dual axis. So single axis we talked about. We usually point those east and west, so the sun tracks across the sky where the panels follow all the way across. They start in the morning and pointing to the east, and they move with the sun. Whereas dual axis allows both this height of sun as well as the movement of the sun across the sky. A couple examples, Firekeepers has dual axis. Everybody's probably driven by their facility. One of the problems you see there is frankly the maintenance cost of maintaining it. You'll oftentimes see them pointed in all different directions. Obviously something goes wrong within the control system, and so high cost. You can only put so many panels in one of those systems as well. The density is a problem. Trying to put so many panels in a flexible system gets to be really expensive, and so we don't advocate that. The costs don't support it being built in Michigan necessarily. Single axis it does, and I'll explain that in just a minute. But you see more dual axis out west again where that radiation is high. So this was the curve, John, and again I apologize for the data points. This differentiates costs. So across the top, you get residential, small scale, commercial, medium scale, utility scale, fixed tilt, utility scale, one axis tracking. You can see the cost, and this is, the bars start at 2010 going left bound or right bound to 2017. Actual cost breakdown from where these project costs are being seen. You can see residential as an example, 2017, $2.80. This is pretty much, I've seen lower than this, but this is pretty much average cost. You can see a large chunk of that is soft cost. So that's land and roof and other things you gotta pay for to build that. You're seeing the transition in costs for most of the things coming down, other than soft costs not really coming down a lot. And that's not different in a lot of the categories. However, if you go all the way to the far right, now we're seeing utility scale PV, 100 megawatts, single axis tracking. You look at 2017 rates. Look how far down everything's come. We're able to buy land and use land and build this effectively. So you're comparing an all-in number of $2.80 a watt DC on residential to $1.11 utility scale. So you're seeing almost a 2.25 times benefit from building something bigger scale.
Why would the soft costs change on the utility side of things, but not on the, like, why would land be cheaper?
Density. So again, I'm building this in farmlands, and that's got a pretty much a cost that's fixated like this. The challenges of acquiring that, the leases that I use nowadays are templated. It's very simple to go to somebody and say, hey, we're willing to do this. To put this up on somebody's roof is a different story. Usually on a roof, you're dealing with building permits, you're dealing with local taxes that Mark might like to talk about. All those challenges are called soft cost. Well, land cost and real property costs that I'm doing, like in Lansing, I could talk about that, are very clear.
I think there's one other key element of soft costs, and that is customer acquisition costs.
Right.
Yeah.
So if I'm a solar installer and I'm doing residential systems, I might deal with 5 potential customers before I get one. So that's also reflected in here. That's the cost of sales, where I'm going around and pitching my business and doing quotes and getting up on roofs, and then somebody comes back and says, well, you know, my finances have changed, or I see the cost is coming down, I'm gonna wait another year or two. They've now expended costs that are in their soft costs that add to the job that
Right.
somebody else finally does. So that jacks up their soft costs, in a sense.
You're seeing shared cost amongst larger projects. That's also beneficial on the soft side of things. You're seeing modules come down in price, although now we're in this world of this embargo scenario, and tariffs have affected deliveries. So we've seen a little bit of pushback on costs. We think that'll alleviate later this year, but right now it's a challenge to get some panels. We are seeing smart inverters come into play. Like I mentioned, the technology of these hardwares are coming down and or going up in terms of capability, coming down in price, and improving in reliability. So you see that in all phases, including cost, and you see it particularly when we talk about performance testing, which I'll get into. Very interesting how this trending is going on, but you can see that costs are coming down quite a bit in all facets. So Delta Solar, I mentioned, this is a project I'm managing. We acquired this project. It was partly developed last year. We finished developing it. We have 4 properties. I invited at the last meeting people to come out. Anytime you want to come out and brave the environment, you're welcome to. We're immediately north of GM's Delta Assembly Plant. This has power sales going to Lansing Board of Water and Light. This is how it's made up. It's kind of complicated because of the number of circuits. It's also complicated by the fact that we've got 3 different types of panels. Fortunately, we stuck to one type of inverter, one type of tracker. It is single axis tracking, and I'll talk a little bit about that. It's 24 megawatts of AC power, 29 megawatts of DC. I'll get into that in a minute as well. And it's got 86,400 modules. So you think of people with 20 to 30 panels on the roof. We have 86,400 panels. So just modules alone, substantial number. We have 400 of the same type of inverters. We have 4,800 Nextrackers. I'll show what that looks like in a minute. So we have a lot of hardware on site, but a lot of it's repetitive, and we've designed it so it can be pretty effective. Why did we pick single axis tracking? On this upper left corner, we talk a little bit about across the bottom is year. So from January to December across the year, you can see obviously in the summer we're getting a lot more generation. Right now in the wintertime, we're not getting so great up in my project in Wisconsin. I can watch it snow, and we can see the impact of that. It's pretty crazy, but online you can see the differences in types of panels. So you can see the fixed tilt is the worst. That's the orange curve in the summer. It does okay in the winter because of the winter scenario again. But you can see the benefits I can get out of single axis tracking, which is the one in blue. And you can't see a lot of difference in dual axis tracking. So unless you have some really high irradiance, we're not gaining a lot of benefit in Michigan for that incremental bump. It's a lot more expensive to manage them. So this was one of the deciding factors is summer peaking. Obviously Michigan is important. We can get that many more megawatts in the summer because we can capture that window. I'll talk a little bit about how we do that in just a second, but that's just kind of a graphical reason why we picked them. You can also see the benefits in the lower right corner, which is a different graph. This is on a daily basis. You can see where the sun comes up. You can see the difference between the darker curve, which is actually fixed axis, in our single axis tracking. The piece that I can grab are the early day pieces. So the sunrise to sunset windows, particularly sunset, that's a peak window when we can actually still generate electricity with the axis tracking that I couldn't have gotten with fixed tilt. So there's benefits on a daily basis, particularly on the ends where I can grab more sun with the single axis. On this upper right corner, this is my project up in Lansing. You can see the inverter box to the right. You can see the solar panels. You can see the torque tube, which is where all these panels mount to. We can put 20 or 18 panels on each torque tube, and then we can drive 2 sets of 18-panel rack with one motor. The bottom left corner is the motor drive. The neat thing about what we're doing at Delta is the little solar panel next to it, this is called self-power. So we're using solar power to drive this. We have a battery behind this. We're actually using the battery to store power to drive the units, which is actually pretty cool.
Yep.
Really a good decision point why we did this. Another interesting thing is by this solar system, if you're fixed and it snows, basically the snow clings to the panel. I drove by our site on my way to Delta the other day. All the panels are encased in snow. Got to Delta site. We're not even stowing and tracking yet, and that's all melted off because of our ability to move the panels. And if it's snowing out, I can put the panels in the opposite direction of the wind blowing and where the snow's coming, so the snow doesn't cling to it, and then move the panel so I can get the most amount of sunlight so it melts off. Also, if it's really windy, if it's 30 to 40 miles an hour, I can move these panels so they're perfectly horizontal and not capture all that wind load, so I don't get the damage. So we have both snow and wind stowing, so I can prevent damage to my panels, all internal to the drive of the system. So that's pretty cool. Another
Chuck, I was
benefit.
on my roof this week with my snow shovel and my snow rake cleaning up my panel.
Scary
I love
stuff.
this.
With your fall protection, I hope.
Yeah, my fall protection, yeah.
So you can see some of that in this picture. So the panel side is on this side, so envision the panel being here. So if I'm facing east in the morning, basically the panel rotates all the way around to facing west at night. And as soon as I lose power coming in, and there's clipping voltages, when I stop generating electricity, this thing overnight returns back to the east, so when the sun comes up. So I'm ready to go the next morning. And if any time we're getting snow or wind, it goes back to a position, the wind stow horizontal, the snow stow in the best position. So pretty interesting. So a few details, I'll go through this quickly. It's kind of boring, I'm sorry, I'm not a good speaker. You can see the panels all in a row on a torque tube on the far left, 18 panels all attached. The drive motor sits on the far bottom. Up at the top is where the inverter is. So we have the DC power looped behind the panels in a flexible conduit all the way to the inverter on the sides, and we have tons of DC collection on site. You'll be able to see that when you come out to site. You can see the AC coming off on the bottom right corner, where we're actually grabbing power that's coming DC all the way to the inverter, and then AC out of the inverter underground to our switchgear. And then on the upper right corner in the single line diagram, you can see at the bottom of it where we're actually already at 13.8 kV, and we're actually routing it from the bottom to the top up to Lansing. So we've got in that pathway, we've got metering, we've got protective relaying, we've got switches all automated and all controllable. If Lansing decides they want to segregate themselves from my solar system, they can also transfer trip me off. So they have the ability remotely to trip this whole system off if there's a safety problem. Again, from a visibility point of view, when you come out, if you're driving through Lansing on I-69, that's this road to the far right side of Delta Solar 2B. So that's this road here. This is I-69-96. If you look, this is right near I-496. And so you'll be able to see this under construction. You'll see this all being cleared. We're basically 100% through our civil design. Delta Solar 1, which is down here, this is probably about 80% built now. We've got all our panels, torque tubes, everything up. That'll be commercial in April. These other two sites, which are Delta Solar 2A, which is along Nixon Road here, and this one along Mount Hope at 96, will be July next year. And like I said, GM Delta is right here. So very visible site, very open and accessible. We have a horse farm over here. The horse riders like to ride around our site and see what we're doing. So it's got some visibility now that they can look at. So this is the Delta Solar yield. I apologize, I'll get into this and go real quickly again. Again, apologize for the graphics, but we've got January through December on the bottom. You can see the production in a bell curve where the summer is generating a lot more electricity. The purple is what we lose just from electrical losses in the system. The green is in the inverters and hardware. The red is what we actually end up generating. So when we're sizing systems and we're trying to come up with how to do this, we model it based on the graph to the right. You can actually physically model the actual solar panels in a PV-SYS model. We can model in, you can see all these little trees around here. We can model in all the shading we want to based on actual conditions. We model this, we play games with orientation, we play games with types of system, we play games with virtually every variable in this, and we let it run to find an optimal solution. In this table here is my outcome, and I create what's called eGrid. This bottom number, 22 megawatts, basically is 2,200,000 megawatt hours per year is what I yield from an annual point of view. This would be what we call a P50, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. This is based on actual site conditions in Lansing based on our configuration, so we can optimize types of panels, size of panels, location, how many trees to cut down, what land to clear, all based on this program, and then actually implement it. So those annual yield factors, like I mentioned, solar radiance, so I talked about that NREL data that says we're not going to do very well in Michigan. We've got a database that tells us exactly what we're going to get in Michigan. We've got some optimized programs like Solar Anywhere that actually give us even better data, so we can bring all that database information in. We can extrapolate weather based on history and assume it's going to continue. Although we know climate change is happening, we're actually modeling different weather going forward in our models than what we've seen historically. We can model in all these electrical losses. We've got shading, which is obviously from trees, soiling, which is snow and other dirt that builds up on the panels, tracker performance and how the actual degradation occurs. So these solar panels you see on people's roofs, usually losing 0.5% a year in performance. We can model all those kinds of things in. And then we take all those variables and we actually do a statistical analysis. And this model over here shows what we're doing. It's called exceedance probability. So we actually predict what the yield's going to be and then look at pessimistic viewpoints in different years, come up with a statistical model, and create what we believe our future's going to be. So in the case of Lansing, we have a 25-year commitment to deliver power to them. I had to look at all these different curves to figure out annually what am I going to produce and what can I sell them and build this up. So I'll talk about the economics in just a minute. Interestingly, I have 6 weather stations on site. So I'm measuring irradiance, I'm measuring snow, I'm measuring wind, I'm measuring solar panel temperature, I'm measuring ambient temperature, all correction factors that I have to factor in. I also run security cameras through that, so don't bother walking on site. I'll be able to watch you. If you happen to walk up and grab something, I'll probably wave at you and you'll be in trouble. I'll call the police. And those are the kinds of things we run through our SCADA system. So like I mentioned, I'll show you in just a minute what I can see right now in another project. And that's this right here. So this is a typical SCADA dashboard. This is a project in Wisconsin that we built that went commercial last year. This is day to day. I can watch the peaks and I can see how it generates day to day. And if I see something out of whack, I've got every inverter power coming into this. And I can see if one individual device goes bad, I can see it right away. I can see, this is one of my cameras. I can actually watch the online live feed day and night to see if anybody's walking through, throwing bowling balls at my panels or whatever. This is on a snowmobile trail, so we do have some people carousing around, so I can watch that and be involved. The bottom right corner is actually day information, so at 12 o'clock on the far left, you can see I'm not generating anything. You can watch the sun come up at 8 o'clock in the morning. All of a sudden, you're seeing our power generation starting to ramp up. This is what's called the DC factor, so we oversize the DC, so we end up with a DC rating factor of higher. I can capture more energy at that ramp up, so you're seeing almost a vertical ramp. We can actually go quickly, whereas if we don't have that tracking capability and that DC power factor, like if you were on an industrial or a residential site, you don't get that. We can actually amplify and gain benefits there. So we also get involved with a lot of that. So this is I can pull it up on my computer right now. I can pull this project up and it's really a wonderful tool that we can use then to monitor our systems to make sure they're healthy. And anything that goes wrong with something on site now alarms through this too. So then I get into the return on investment economics. All those modeling and inputs I talked about have to be addressed in terms of a power purchase agreement. Typically we have one of those if we're selling to a specific market or a utility. If the utility itself may have market reasons why they would build it, and then C&I customers usually have some kind of a sustainability goal as to why they might build something this big. So there's always a driver, always a goal, but they are always having an economic component. We then do this modeling on what's called pro forma modeling, where we bring in tax. So investment tax credits come into this, real estate taxes come into this, any kind of a parameter that could affect us, and then we look at it sensitivity-wise. If Trump changes our tax laws next year, we've already modeled, like Delta, we already know what the impact could be and what range it's going to be in. So we know what we have to watch out for or what we want to be a proponent on from a taxation point of view. And we've factored in all that information in the capacity side of the equation in the model. So we've got abilities to make sure we're not going to lose out on this investment. And then we have an internal hurdle on whether we invest in projects or not that is called the internal rate of return, or IRR. I could talk about financials for quite a while. I do this almost every day now to find out what the sweet spot is for projects that are utility scale and where it fits. So what are the conclusions from what I just talked about very quickly? City-owned solar PV has varying rooftop options. We've talked a lot about this. U of M gave us a nice lecture with microgrids and solar last year, concluded that fire stations made sense. Obviously, local positioning of solar still makes tremendous sense, particularly if it's got a critical load factor. If it's a fire station, if it's a police station, if it's federal buildings, things like that. Rooftop solar, no doubt about it, locally makes tremendous sense. if we're trying to make a sustainability goal which has tremendous reductions in greenhouse gas caused by investments in utility scale, doesn't make a lot of sense. It's not going to work out real well from a global point of view. So this aggregating of rooftop solar, probably not great in terms of large-scale investment. DTE's Michigan Green Power Program obviously demonstrates scalable solar. You can see the benefits and just the numbers. If you look at the rates, I think, John, you pointed out the other day how that's an option for the city, is invest in an existing solar system with fixed rates. You've eliminated a lot of the risks, and there's some benefits there. You can see the economic recovery. You can invest in it. And it makes sense from a community solar point of view. Same thing. Growth, size, scale all make sense, and I think you're seeing it in the numbers I presented today. Is there more large-scale solar PV like Delta and like Lapeer coming? Of course it is. Even in the spite of the 17% capacity factor, it's so much easier to site. We don't have the NIMBY problem. We can put it on landfills. We can put it over water. We can do all kinds of things with solar panels nowadays that make sense on land that couldn't be used for other reasons. It only makes sense to continue with that mindset. And so I'm working on a 40 megawatt solar project right now as we speak, another one up north. These are starting to pop up all over the place, and I think we're going to start seeing some of these scalable projects coming closer to us too. So in a nutshell, looking at this community solar task force that we have, I'm not sure where it's at, John, in terms of its status. The numbers are starting to look pretty attractive. So. And open it up for questions.
Chuck, have you done a community solar model to consumers? And how does that, some of your earlier projects were consumers, but this is different. You're a private company now, right?
Well, so to be clear, I'm on CMS Enterprises. I'm on the non-regulated side of
Right.
CMS, so I'm working on, we have a lot of biomass projects in the state. We have solar all over the country. We're working in wind and other spaces as well. So I'm on the non-regulated. I'm not with the utility. I was at one time. I'm still doing some utility
But the utility
work.
is your primary customer, so you're a merchant plant,
We're merchant.
basically. So the other community solar projects that Consumers Energy did were not done through merchant plants. They were owned.
Rate
and they
based, right.
Ratepayer based. So does the fact that you are in this, I guess, the merchant plant option lend itself to community solar more so than the regulated side?
From a municipal power basis, of course, it does. Makes a lot of sense. Where you have munis who have to provide power to their
Right.
customers, constituents. They want it to be local based. They want it to be reasonably priced. They like that alternative. They basically sell to their constituent base saying that they're less expensive than a utility. So they're going to have to look at things like this to keep their costs down. From a infrastructure utility point of view, I'm going to just say the answer is it depends a lot. The community solar projects that Consumers built, Grand Rapids and Western Michigan, Kalamazoo area, the subscription rates have gone up quite a bit. They're in the 90s plus, I've been told. So a lot of people have invested in them, but those projects were developed 3 or 4 years ago at a pretty high price. Those same
Right.
projects today would look different, and the subscription hurdle would be lower. So the cost to invest. So time is changing, and that's why it's so hard to say in a crystalline format, what is the cost going to look like? If you look at all the trends of cost data for solar PV, it's kind of flat. We're not going to see these major stepwise changes we've seen in the last 4 years. We're going to see continued reduction in capital cost, but I'm not sure, it's not going to be to the same levels we've seen in the last 2 to 3 years. The investment tax credit piece is going to start phasing out. It's hard to predict what could happen in 3 to 4 years.
Maybe if I can add, that Lazard chart had a few different sizes, and so I think that's an important piece with these economies of scales. When
Right.
what they call that utility scale solar, that's not a community solar project.
Right.
The community solar projects are still, they're kind of, some of them are like very large residential, and some
Right.
of them are sort of on the small scale of what you would call commercial. So the prices for those, when DTE would look at something like that, it's still way out of whack compared to what we could do through a really, truly utility scale thing like the Lapeer one,
Right.
or like this
Right.
Delta one, which is kind of at that level as well. So you know, I think that's one of the considerations that remains is, you know, do you want something that's community solar because people really like the idea of, you know, that's my panel and that's in, maybe not my neighborhood, but in my city and I drive by it and there's that ownership and people are willing to pay more for it? Or something like the My Green Power program where you're essentially buying into something that is truly at the utility scale where your costs are going to be much lower. And I think those economies of scale will remain.
Yeah, you can kind of see that here where this graph where you have commercial at 200 kilowatt scale was looked at and it's $1.85. You can see 100 megawatts at $1.03. That's a pretty big swing just in terms of scale. So if your community solar was in the 3 to 4 to 5 megawatt range, you're going to be paying more like the commercial PV pricing installed cost than you would be seeing from a utility scale. So there is a premium to pay for that.
So just a question on the costing from a customer or city perspective. Because, you know, I see a little disconnect because it seems like the costs are coming way down, right? The utility scale and you know, you're showing costs that are competitive or less than natural gas, coal, et cetera. But, and I'm not very familiar with the program, with DTE, the My Green Power, that's actually a cost premium right now, right? So talk to me about the difference in pricing there.
I'll say a couple things. One is that if you look at the Lazard chart and you compare the costs, all of that is the cost of new generation. And so, yeah, if you were going to build a new coal or gas plant, it's going to be close to on par. But the power that consumers or DTE or some other utility is supplying is long depreciated and it's not new. And so the costs that you're paying for that are well below the levelized cost of new generation. So that's a really big piece of it. And then the second piece I would say is that all of these are, as somebody in the audience mentioned, that you're just looking at the generation side of it.
Right.
And unless you're gonna go without power when the sun's not shining, you need to pay for some portion of the distribution and transmission costs as well, so that's an adder.
I mean, I would also say too, that program is potentially changing. The Public Service Commission, as part of the legislation that was passed in 2016, was tasked with developing a green pricing program, essentially. And they're going through the process right now, figuring out what that is, and there's going to be a public comment period at the end of January. So the idea that there is a premium right now for those sorts of programs is true, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be set in stone for going forward.
Yeah, because
Yeah, to add to
interested, I get the sort of, you know, the reason for that. It leads to, at a minimum, a public perception problem, right? Because what that says then to the public is solar and, you know, renewable energy is more expensive. And I hear what you're saying, because you're not comparing apples to apples, particularly on the new generation piece. But I guess, you know, I think about it from our role as a community-facing commission, how we actually explain that and how we, you know, put that out there. I'm sorry, Chuck, you're going to jump in there. But.
Yeah, so to the distributed generation case that's out with MPSC, I actually commented on it. I gave them 2 pages of comments to it.
This is different. The green pricing program, not
okay,
is
so
what I was talking about.
There's a lot of programs.
Yeah.
We have a lot of green pricing programs. Consumers does as well. So that's out there. I think that depending on what you're wanting, there's different shopping lists you can go after. Because solar DG's out there, we've got solar green power, we've got green rates to industrials. There's a lot of different ways to factor into it. I think the bigger driver is T&D cost. I think there's some sunk cost in just the infrastructure to build it that get translated over. So versus doing it yourself. And I have friends of mine who are not on the grid, who've built their own microgrid, if you will. And they see the cost then of building all that infrastructure and that degree of security. So you're starting to see a little bit of pushback on that. You can see some of the rate cases that I've seen recently where we're trying to assign what are those costs to each customer. If a customer wants to build something at their own property, what is the intrinsic cost of all that T&D associated with it? And we're trying to get away from standby costs. So I think those are going to be a wave of the future too. All those stranded asset costs we've accrued over time, hopefully will be capitalized and won't be in our rate structure. That's a hope.
But I really think the new generation piece of it is the most important, because if you look at you know, DTE's put out their plans of what they're gonna be building over the next 20 years, right? And Consumers has their plans too. Nobody's building new coal, and frankly, that's probably irregardless of the regulations and stuff in that space, just economically. So, and the other piece with that, you know, as you look at this, so DTE has said they're gonna be building gas combined cycles and renewables, the larger chunk of which is gonna be wind and some of which will be solar. And if you look at these charts, I know this Lazard analysis well, and I know that the numbers that they show in here for the solar are in the southwest for southwest irradiation levels, where it's best. That range there is for that. So it's higher than that in Michigan, and the wind is at the very nice low end of this scale. So in Michigan, wind is even more advantageous than it sort of shows on this chart economically. So that kind of mix is, in fact, for new generation, is in fact reflective of what you would see here as kind of the low-cost options with some mix of those three.
And that's why the utilities have to do integrated resource planning. We look at this as a set of data, but we can't entrust that this is Michigan. So Michigan has each utility has to write an integrated resource plan. DTE's, I think, just got filed or in the course of being filed as part of the gas project. So there's reasons why these studies are done and why we do alternative analyses to validate what makes sense. Another component that typically is missed is the market. We're no longer really a utility. We use the word utility in a bad way. We're load-serving entities. So we being Consumers Energy has the responsibility to service its customers with electricity. To do that, we have to buy power from MISO. We, in fact, flip that around on the other side of the equation, and we sell power to MISO. We generate because we view that to be an economy of scale that we can benefit from. Shoshana mentioned this older generation we built and already paid for. We can sell into the marketplace and make some money at it. The market may drive the utility to be less generating intensive and more load-serving entities. So the market may serve a different purpose. We're always balancing our investments. And that has to be watched very carefully, because if you're buying power nowadays off the market, it looks a little different than it did in the old days. So that's another part of this levelized cost of generation that has to be factored in your investment decision on what you build.
I just have a question or answer or a comment that the Ann Arbor solar program and energy efficient programs are based on trying to reduce emissions. So it's these are things that we are doing in order to reduce emissions. And with DTE's new plans that we will see this year, Josh and Nate and stuff were able to adjust some of the climate action plan goals and lower those, but there's still a gap. If we want to get to a parts per million rating where we believe that, you know, we're not going to be creating more problems, that the Earth can absorb this, then we've got to have a environmental footprint that's here. And I guess as I look at the historical costs here, I have to say, well, yes, that's true. Solar PV rooftop residential is more expensive. That's because we had no other option up until the point where we're now seeing the utilities do what many of us said you could have made the most sense, which is large-scale PV is cheaper, and it would have been cheaper a long time ago too. So it's great that it's happening now, but as a community, we're still looking at, you know, I guess our choice is to say, okay, well, the climate action plan, we'll just wait to see what the utilities do, or we'll factor what the utilities are going to do into our plan and fill in the gaps, or we'll, you know, factor in what the utilities are going to do and fill into the gaps in a way that's really smart. And one could make the case that utilities have solar taken care of. We don't need to worry about that. Our climate action plan calls for 80% reduction in emissions from energy efficiency, and we have enough to do there to keep all of us busy for a long, long, long time, and maybe that's where we should be focusing our efforts. That assumes that the utilities are going to continue doing solar and exceed whatever the limiting RPS that the state puts out, that there's a conscious business decision that says, well, we don't care what you do, Lansing, we're going to do 50% or 70%, whatever the percentage is, but it'll always be more aggressive than than what the state does until this thing begins to make sense. So from our body here, trying to make a decision, do we do a second generation of a solar program in Ann Arbor and encourage people to put solar on their roofs and try to put together projects, even though we can't, we have to do behind the meter programs because we don't have any other options? Or, how do we take what you're telling us and help us, guide us going forward? Because there's a lot of gray in this. The numbers, certainly utility scale generation makes sense.
Yep.
Absolutely. When are you going to do more?
I think it's the staff at answering
Sure.
Mark's question.
Absolutely.
So, Chuck mentioned earlier, Commissioner Hookham, that there is some community solar activities in Ann Arbor. I'd like to recognize that a number of people in the room, both commissioners as well as virtually everybody in the audience, Jay Zucker, Steve Brown, also Larry Kerber, are working in subgroups for that subcommittee. And the way I view it, and I would welcome people challenging this, is that the way I see this is we would like to offer consumers options. And just like consumers buy a purse for $5,000 and they buy a purse for $20 at TJ Maxx, there's people that like to be able to say, there's my school, there's my solar panels on my school, my kid goes to that school, and I'd like to see solar at that school. There's consumers that want that. There are consumers that want solar on their roof. They're willing to pay for that premium. But I think the moral of the story, like what Chuck and also Shoshana are telling us, is that there are economies of scale. And what we would, I think, in my view, want to do to Ann Arbor consumers is say, we inform you of the different kinds of options that are out there. You can buy, as you do today, from DTE for this price. You can buy from DTE for My Green Power, which is a kind of community solar option, and this is what it looks like. These are the pros and cons. You can do that. You can buy other kinds of community solar through other organizations. Steve has put together some preliminary numbers comparing other people that offer power where you get that credited against your DTE bill, and this is what the features are of that. And then here are different community solar options, whether it's the Solar Faithful initiative that Nate's group is working on, or whether with houses of worship, or whether it's schools, or whether it's something that would be on the roof of a nonprofit here locally. There's a bunch of different ranges. And if you want this kind of solar and you're willing to pay this price because you want to identify with it and it's on your roof or it's on your school or on your church, then this is what you get. And if you really want to do it the most effective way, then here's another option, doing it at utility scale together with a utility, or maybe something in between where it's a very, very large scale community solar option. Is that fair?
It's fair. We call that alternatives analysis or integrated resource planning, and the city should be able to do that itself.
Right.
There's enough information to do that, to pick which option fits the 2035 plan.
Right.
I think that's where you run ahead.
Yep. And the DTE My Green Power is potentially a bridging option. So if you want to say, I don't want to just buy the current mix from DTE, I want to be able to identify with green power. I'm willing to pay for My Green Power and pay a premium, and you can do that for 1 year or you can do that for 5 years, and then if later at some point you want to buy into community solar, whether it's a medium scale or a large scale, you can bail then and do that. So I think what we're hopefully doing with these community solar options is indeed giving people options, both short as well as long term, ones that maybe some that are portable, some that are not, and inform consumers with this alternative analysis and have them make a choice.
Right.
Is that fair?
The one thing I want to bring up too that always is missing from arguments or discussions on this point is reliability. As soon as we lose power, like my neighborhood all knows I have a generator. As soon as we lose power, DT's a bad actor. We've got to have power now. My internet's down. So I got extension cords coming my way. which is okay. I like to share my generator. I'm okay with that. But the reality of it is people today can't afford to be minutes without electricity. And so the price you pay if you were to go off the grid and do your own thing and it doesn't work, you only have one way to point. You got off the grid. The viability and benefit of that reliability is immense. And particularly the bigger you get, the more important it is to have backup power. So that grid connection is pretty critical, and it's important to remember that when you're talking costs too. That grid costs a lot of money to put together. It's like our interstate system. So. Thank you.
Well done, Chuck.
Any other questions? Outstanding presentation. I assume we'll have access to this on the website?
Yeah,
or-
it's up now.
It's up.
Start, yep. This is the link just below the item. It's a unique identifier, and that means it's up, posted.
Outstanding. Chuck, as you know, we've talked about having you come to the board meeting at the GLREA, and this is the presentation. I think that would be perfect for
I
that.
can do better
Um,
tailored for
yes,
that. No
yes.
problem.
So appreciate it. Thank you. So FY19 city policy agenda input.
Yes, so we, the various boards and commissions have been asked to help formulate and assist the policy agenda committee for council, and this is largely going to, we can spend a little time discussing this. There'll probably be a follow-up afterwards to solicit ideas from the body here on priorities for the next year. And there's now a boards and commissions coordinator who sent word out. The final policy agenda is presented to council by the end of March, and so we've kind of got some ideas kicking around, and I'll send those through to everyone. Again, thinking about, it's a little fine-tuned in terms of detail versus broader policy ideas, and so I'll be sure to send those around, and you can funnel them back directly to me. We'll send some instructions for how to do that. I don't know that we haven't requested a formal resolution, but we'll want to some way final that.
Where'd those come from, staff?
So staff we have some from last year, and I'll be able to, a link I can send around has 2018's priorities, for instance. I'll just kind of read off some of that as it pertains to our topic area. In the interest of promoting a sustainable and healthy environment and the well-being of the community, the council directs the following: monitor potential state actions on water taxation systems, pursue remedies that incent the installation of sustainable and renewable energy resources, including but not limited to residential and community solar and wind systems. So tend to be broader policy things, the whole issue around solar taxation. We, of course, for instance, recently had the carbon fee and dividend resolution both at this group and at the council, so that certainly could be one area to continue to hold true to that position of advocacy. Some of the new ideas that have come forth include pursuing legislative remedies, again, that remove disincentives for installation of renewable energy, included but not limiting to statewide property tax exemptions, pursuing legislative remedies to support appropriate local access to utility data on gas and electricity, support and advocate for the incorporation of high-performance building efficiency systems in the Uniform Building Code. That's something Commissioner Hookham has also discussed. So kind of a list to jump off from, but it's sort of the floor will be yours to think about the kinds of things that we think we want to help council or the city rather advocate for through this policy agenda committee. So if there's anything or ideas, and I know John had received this also through the Environmental Commission's going through a similar exercise, certainly has a broader topic area to cover. But namely, look for that, some instructions, and just coming back to me as to how we can really codify a list for the clerk's office and for council for early mid-March.
So Nate, you'll send an email out?
Yep.
With the intent? Okay.
Yep, so that'll link to last year's priorities for 18. This sort of tentative list is a jumping off point that we have assembled already, and that way to kind of orient you with a little bit of how the request has at least been put to staff. So
Outstanding. Any questions on that? stuff. When do we email next week, do you think?
Yeah, this week.
This week,
Yeah,
excellent.
probably tomorrow.
All right, tomorrow, perfect. 2018 committee's work plan.
Yeah, so this is the second document in your packet, if you will, and I just wanted to note some updates to the version that I was able to print. The last work session, again, that was discussed, what are proposed work plan for 2018. So the chair had assembled this and did want to note we have names sort of assigned, and the question has gone out as to anyone wanting to jump on any of these topic areas. Commissioner Jameson has also indicated ordinance support if necessary, so I wanted to recognize that. Commissioner Levin, likewise, on ordinances and outreach to schools, and I understand Commissioner Lenski also on the outreach to schools topic. So just to slightly update this a little bit beyond what's in front of you. So if your name is not on here and you'd like to jump onto any of these topic areas, if you haven't already, though I know most now have, this is a chance to do so.
Nate, on the ordinances one, are we also looking at updating what's currently in our program?
I think that can certainly be part of it. I know we
Yeah.
talked a little bit last time about kind of retiring
Right.
vestigial bits of code and things like that.
I would
Yeah.
recommend that.
Yep.
Bring it up to date.
Yep.
I was gonna ask a question, and I wasn't here for the last one, but do we have anywhere a listing of the ordinances that we have been considering over time? I think each of us might have sort of a mental list. I know I can think of a few, but I'm just trying to, it seems like the first task for that group would be, okay, here are the ones that are under consideration in some way. And I should say, I have an intern that's from the public policy school that's been compiling some of the best practices around the country as well to help us get started on this. But his question to me was, well, what are all the ones that you've been thinking of? And I was like, well, I can remember a few, but is there any? And maybe you, Nate, maybe you know all these, but
They live in probably different iterations. Certainly the first, if not one of the first exercises would be to bring together both, whether it's existing code language and aspirational ideas that we've talked about around benchmarking or time of market, those sorts of things. So staff is happy to assist that effort to kick that particular group off. But I think that sort of national, if there's already an exercise underway to pull together the latest thinking, helps augment, tools like, or resources we have like USDN, where we likewise try and do that.
right.
I'm happy to start that up. I mean, I signed on to the ordinances subcommittee with the specific interest in the MLS listings, but I can start from a broader perspective, just looking at the work that we've done so far.
Great. And I might add, and a few commissioners know this, that Wayne Appleyard initiated a list of ordinance-related questions directed to the city attorney, and I added a few, and a couple other people did, and we now have answers to those from the attorney's office. Those have been sent to the group that sort of was associated with putting that together, so we should probably look at that list and make sure that, I've already circled and made myself a note, that everybody working on this also has those answers about what at least the attorney's office feels it can, or we can and cannot do. Because it doesn't make sense, obviously, putting a lot of work into something that at least the attorney is not particularly in favor of doing, or says just can't be done.
Yeah,
It's one big hurdle.
Yeah, and I guess the other thing I would say on that, and really for Councilman, if if we know in advance where council is going to be working, if there are ways to link those up, it's always better for us, I feel like, if we can be part of a, existing effort or something that's happening in council. So I'm sure we'd rely on you for that in particular.
At the work session, I explained that I believe that this is an advisory board. We should be telling council our best advice. I'm your liaison, I'll communicate your advice, and we just need to get them to listen. We have a very favorable council for energy matters. So if the city attorney says that we can do it, and you advise that we should do it, then we just have our work set for us, to do it.
Fair enough.
Commissioner Hookham, 6 months or so ago, you talked about the building codes and some effort that you were thinking about where going to the state where communities would have more say over the building codes. Our hands are not as tied as we think they are. Has anything come of that? And does that relate to what we're talking about here at all?
To a certain extent, I think I ran into some language that indicated that local municipalities could not offer changes. You could do things in planning documentation and/or things that we've already done, like assessing benefits for doing LEED or doing different renewables on new developments. It's hard to enforce beyond that. It's hard to change locally anything
Right.
from the state. I'm not done yet, but I haven't done anything lately.
Keep up the good fight. All right. Any other comments on this topic? Ordinance, we want to talk more about ordinances, anybody? You sure? Okay. We're now to the point in our agenda.
Before we do that, if
Sure,
I may,
certainly.
I just want to mention verbally, and hopefully there'll be something in writing. I put together a list because I was sort of ruminating over the last year, how did things go in terms of sustainability in Ann Arbor, both in terms of wins as well as some disappointments. I put together a list. I've run it by Wayne Appleyard, as well as Commissioner Hutton, Chair of the Environmental Commission, also shared it with Nate and Matt, and my intention is to share it with the administrator and then hopefully get this out in a more formal way. But I thought I might just mention some of the wins that we've had last year, because sometimes, admittedly, I've been discouraged at time, but after going through this list, I have to say I really felt good about what the city has done, and that includes also the commissions. And I'll just read a couple of them to you. So, resolution committing Ann Arbor to use 100% clean and renewable energy for all city operations by 2035 was unanimously passed by council in December. The county millage passed for public safety and mental health, and council committed that 40% of those funds will go flowing to Ann Arbor from proceeds from that millage will go to climate action, or roughly $900,000 a year for 8 years. And in discussions with the administrator, he's agreed that the vast majority of those will be spent on community-facing programs. Council passed a new green building policy in May, which required LEED Silver minimum standards and solar potential analysis for new buildings and major reconstruction. The city administrator has agreed to convert 2 longtime seasonal employees working for Nate and Matt to full-time positions. My understanding is that the administrator and council has agreed to some organizational structural changes that will lead to the creation of an Office of Sustainability and Innovation that's going to be led by an officer with 4 to 6 staff members. So we're going to get real staffing that's focused on sustainability issues. I mentioned earlier we have this neighborhood partnering program. The name still formally hasn't been decided, but that's funded with $100,000 a year, so groups can come in and say, hey, we want to do this for climate mitigation, rainwater, whatever it might be, and apply for grants. Nate also mentioned just a few minutes ago, council agreed to endorse a carbon fee and dividend program that would happen at the national level, basically supporting that. I won't go on. That's maybe, 7 things that I've mentioned. The list that I have is 15 items long, so there's a lot of really good things. And there's a couple of disappointments, which we talked about already. Some of the developments related to solid waste and recycling could be improved, but the picture was not as bad as what was reflected at the Environmental Commission. Residential solar continues to be taxed, but maybe there's some opportunities to improve that situation. And then lastly, as was also mentioned, the Ann Arbor Solar Club program that was launched last year met its demise with our partner as Councilman Eaton mentioned, but luckily we were able to have some installations made, and we are going to hopefully make everybody else whole between now and March or so, and hopefully we'll have a replacement program. So the disappointments were certainly not disasters, and I think the wins were really some significant wins, and I think a lot of people deserve credit for that.
I think the elimination of solar permitting fee, if it's not on your list.
That is on the
you
list,
should put that. Okay.
indeed.
Good.
Nate, thank you. That's all.
Any more questions, any input of John on this? Well, now we're ready for public input. Once again, we invite the members of the audience who would like to come up and introduce themselves and give us some input. Please.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. My name is Stephen Brown. I'm a citizen here in Ann Arbor. And first, I'd like to thank Chuck for the presentation. It's wonderful to have data to work with. And I don't think you talk too fast. And the second thing is that I'm wondering if the Energy Commission would consider looking at, for example, what's happened in Minnesota, the regulatory environment there, that it's been much more positive in, for implementing community solar in that state from 2013, I believe. And I'm wondering if the Energy Commission would take on a relatively minor project, hopefully, to put together a set of policy recommendations that they could forward to our state representatives about what changes they would recommend be made in Michigan law to make community solar more attractive, especially looking at the Minnesota model, which has, a climate similarity to Michigan.
John is the chair of that committee, but I would certainly think that would be within the scope of what we're trying to do there, to come up with
So Nate
what needs to
also
get changed.
helped me out here, but one of the things that also is being compiled at this time is what we're requesting the city's lobbyists to do at the state level in terms of policy changes. And as Nate mentioned a few minutes ago, one of the things that we're looking at doing locally and at the state level is policy changes related to promoting renewable energies, including potentially community solar. So I don't know, Nate, I don't know.
That dovetails perfectly with the assignment that'll be sent out tomorrow.
Yeah.
I would also add too, I know Jeff Irwin from previous sessions has introduced a package of bills called the Energy Freedom Package. A component of that was on community solar. I would definitely expect a similar set of bills, whether in a package or whether individually, to be introduced again this year. I think that it's beneficial to provide input and thoughts about what the state could and should be doing to better support community solar. That being said, I think the political reality of this year is that I doubt very strongly that we'll see any changes coming out of the state legislature on that. Not to say that we shouldn't, advocate for it or promote it, but I just think in terms of the outcome for the rest of this legislative session, that I don't necessarily see that moving forward.
I agree.
But yeah, I think it's a good suggestion.
It's good to be persistent and polite.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right.
All right, well, thank you.
Anything else? Thank you very much. Any other input? Well, we thank you for coming. If there are any other items or anyone would like to raise or comment on before we move to adjournment?
Also items for the next agenda.
Oh, and items for the next agenda, excuse me.
Yeah, the only one thing I know, we were trying to get a consistency across bylaws through the different boards. I think we'll have a hopefully short topic on how that affects Energy Commission from additional staff. So bylaws consistency, get ready.
Bylaws consistency, get ready. We'll have that at the next agenda, I assume.
That's right.
That'll probably consume the entire meeting.
Try not to.
The group from the Ann Arbor Stephen Northside School.
Push it kind of hard to get. There we go.
There we go. The Ann Arbor Stephen Northside Solar Club is working on a presentation for the February meeting. It'd be great if we could get some time for them.
For here?
Great. Yes. Oh, that would be good. Yes. It'd be fun to have them come.
I just assume for the next agenda too, if each of the work groups would meet between now and then, since they're set up, hopefully that would be a pretty big chunk would be to, you know, sort of the results from those first meetings and how it's gonna play out over the year. So, maybe that's obvious, but it seems like that could be the sort of meat of the agenda for next time.
Mhm.
I think somebody said the second name on each of these work groups is the chair, not the first name. I heard that.
I didn't hear that. Oh, I'm not the second. I heard that too.
No. I'm second on two. so.
Any other items? Well, having heard none, I'll entertain a motion for adjournment.
So,
Second? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Meeting is adjourned. Ugh.